Some brief notes on the writing of David Rattray. Part 1. Life, Risk, and Tradition. Lately, I've taken on this curious habit of starting to write just before moving on to a new activity. At present, I'm just about to make breakfast, which I'm in desperate need of. Why, I wonder, do I do this to myself? I suppose simply it is a matter of, if I don't write this now, then I may never write it, which gives a kind of urgency to these brief notes and books I'm reading. Extrapolating to general principles, my days are subject to a calculus of in-betweens, so that the only way I can trick the mind into doing anything at all is to employ a crude differential mathematics. Example, given a series of activities, sleep, coffee, cleaning, food, etc., occurring as a function of desire, I can derive the optimal moment for writing by determining the point closest to, but not coterminous with, the activity which corresponds with the highest level of desire. And it is this intuitive mathematics that leads me to write about David Rattray's book, How I Became One of the Invisible. Okay, so I've just finished a run of essays devoted to 4 poets, the most recent being a piece on a mid-century Pakistani poet named Faiz Ahmed Faiz, who writes in Urdu, which Rattray tells us is a form of Hindi with Arabic, Persian, and Turkish influences, much like Yiddish is to German. The essay is, if nothing else, as with all these essays, a useful resource for someone such as myself seeking poetry and tradition other than one's own. But more than that, Rattray's writing calls forth questions pertaining to the very nature of poetry and its relationship to society, or better yet, to life, an operative term throughout this book. Poetry's relation to life, as is the case with Faiz, is one of urgency. Poetry is nothing less than, quote, the invention of life through language, end quote. It's no mistake that Rattray returns throughout this essay to the image of Faiz standing before a crowd of 50,000 listeners whose vying ears receive his poetry as one receives food and hunger. This image is echoed in his Letter to a Young Poet, where Rattray speaks of an oral epic bard in a room full of Turkish peasants who, quote, stare at him, some of them with tears in their eyes, hanging on every word, breathless, carried away, end quote. These illustrate something of the affective economies of a poetry steeped in life. Rattray notes that we, what he calls Westerners, might think Faiz's poetry antiquated, with its talk of unutterable sweetnesses, streaming gold, and sultry honey. But we would be remiss, he says, because we would have overlooked entirely the political overtones of these poems. Faiz was himself a dissident in Pakistan, newly formed in his time, where he attempted with others to overthrow the right-wing regime and as a result sat for 4 years on death row. In this sense, the invention of life is a risky political act, and risk for Rattray is a kind of raison d'etre for any poet worth their salt. Witness. Writing about Crevel's book, L'amour difficile, Rattray says it was, quote, a risky book to put forward in 1926 because it was a public statement of the author's ambivalent sexuality, end quote. And it was risky again in 1985, quote, because of the author's disregard of received ideas on the subject, of ordinary prejudices attached to it, combined with a bone-deep honesty in his disclosure of his own feelings and experiences. As for Faiz and his precedents, quote, these were political-minded people who made a habit of sticking their necks out and often paid the price for their audacity. Rattray, disappointed, turns on his readers and himself. Quote, which of us present-day American poets is laying it out on the line the way these folks did? In a culture where risk-taking is a high-prestige activity, we're a low-profile crowd, end quote. These admonitions harken back to an earlier passage in the same essay where the author laments the lack of a true tradition among our poets. Sure, we have our museums, themselves a product of colonialism, and are able to analyze, synthesize, and compare until we're blue in the cheeks, but what do we have to say for ourselves? Not much, says Rattray. We lack that violent sense of life that exists in the poetry of Faiz. What Rattray means when he uses the word tradition is not entirely clear. Whatever it is, it marks the opening of a space where risk becomes a possibility, and life too. Because to risk everything is finally to live, and living, which is to say inventing life, is itself a risk when executed with unwavering prophetic honesty. Tradition in this sense might have more to do with a certain improvisational attitude like that described by performance studies scholar Fred Moten in a conversation with Frank Stewart at the Cooper Gallery. Improvisation, Moten observes, is etymologically derived from the Latin improviso, meaning lack of foresight. That is, it's a matter of the unforeseen and of not looking forward, which means, he suggests, that in order to improvise, you might need to look backward. The jazz musician, for instance, needs to pay heed to the notes that came before in order to make hay out of the notes to come. To flesh out this idea, Moten turns to Walter Benjamin's Theses on the Philosophy of History, where the German theorist describes what he calls the angel of history, and pardon the long quote. This is how one pictures the angel of history. His face is turned toward the past, where we perceive a chain of events. He sees one single catastrophe which keeps piling wreckage upon wreckage and hurls it in front of his feet. The angel would like to stay, awaken the dead, and make whole what has been smashed. But a storm is blowing from paradise. It has got caught in his wings with such violence that the angel can no longer close them. The storm irresistibly propels him into the future, to which his back is turned, while the pile of debris before him grows skyward. That's the end of the quote. Caught in the headwind of history, the angel looks backward. And what he sees is a pile of wreckage he can't reconstruct, and a mountain of dead bodies he can't revive. The improvisational attitude, as theorized by Moten and illustrated in Benjamin's scene, is not necessarily pleasant, and in fact it can really hurt. Moten recalls at an event in Glasgow, hearing a jazz trumpetist Wadada Smith say how much it hurt to get through his solo, and poet-novelist M. Norbezi Philip describe her experience writing Zong as hurtful. But if improvisation is marked by pain, it is also a means toward life, which we apprehend when Moten says he's interested in how, in quote, how we lived with it and through it. Refracting Rattray through Moten, we might think of tradition less as the hunky-dory mythos of grandfather time, and more as what Moten calls, quote, the refuge of an ongoing displacement, end quote. Along these lines, tradition refers to the always already provisional and improvisational habitus of a people trying to make their way through the muck and wreckage of history. The movement through tradition by way of a process of repetition, revision, and critique is what we might call, following Moten, improvisation. And improvisation carries with it both the means toward life and a great twofold risk. 1, we risk the pain involved in going back toward the wreckage. And 2, we risk exposing our vulnerable backs to the pain of an unforeseen and unforeseeable future. For Moten, this is an apt way of describing the condition of contemporary black poetry. And so, we might wonder, as a parallel to our question regarding tradition, what precisely Rattray has in mind when he refers to, quote, us present-day American poets. But I think I'll have to put off addressing this question to a later date, as I really need to make breakfast now.